In this video, you're going to learn all about the top 20 common Spanish verb hacer, which is a verb you need to know well if you want to take your Spanish to the next level. Now, specifically, you're going to learn 3 ways this verb can appear in a Spanish sentence and 7 common uses. Hola, soy Andrés. I'm Andrew y aprendo español desde hace más de 20 años. And I've been learning Spanish for over 20 years. I've also been running a Spanish school for the last 10 years called Real Fast Spanish, which has helped over 3,000 students work towards their goals of conversational Spanish. Now, this video is part 3 in a series I've been doing recently on common everyday Spanish verbs. And the main theme of this series is the 3 main sentence structures you'll come across when studying Spanish. And that's normal verbs, verbs like gustar, and reflexive verbs. Now, many verbs in Spanish, including hacer, can appear in all 3 of these structures, and there will generally be a change in meaning for each. This means for hacer, you could encounter hago, me hace, or me hago. Now, we're going to start this video with the normal form hago because it's the most common use for conversational Spanish. Now, in this normal form, hacer can mean to make or to do, which is typically easier to translate from English to Spanish since both to make and to do will become hacer. For example, what are you doing? ¿Qué haces? I'm just doing my job. Solo hago mi trabajo. Now, a question students will often ask me when translating I'm doing or I'm making, should we say hago or estoy haciendo? Now, I've talked about this question in my video on using gerunds in Spanish. I'll link to this video below. But for now, the short answer is that both are grammatically acceptable and interchangeable in many situations in Spanish. What is worth thinking about, though, is that Spanish students will prefer to say something like solo estoy haciendo mi trabajo because it looks much more like English. But in general, Spanish natives may often prefer the hago form because it's shorter. As a Spanish teacher, what I'm trying to do all of the time is help students produce grammatically accurate sentences, but of course, also sentences that sound natural. So I encourage you to practice saying hago or haces as a translation of I'm doing or I'm making or you're doing or you're making to get used to this common pattern in Spanish. The next common use of hacer is for talking about the weather. For example, it is hot today. Hoy hace calor. So rather than saying literally it is hot like we would in English, we need to say it makes heat. Hace calor. Now here are some more examples of hacer for talking about the weather. We could say hace frío, it is cold. Hace viento, it is windy. Hace sol, it is sunny. You could even say hace 32 grados, it is 32 degrees, or hace buen tiempo, which would be the weather is nice or the weather is good. Next, we can use hacer to talk about time, specifically how long ago something happened or how long something has been happening for. Now, to do this, we need to combine hace, again, but this time with a period of time. For example, hace 2 días, 2 days ago. Hace una semana, a week ago. Hace 4 meses, 4 months ago. Hace 10 años, 10 years ago. You could even say shorter time periods like hace 3 horas, 3 hours ago, or a more general, hace mucho tiempo, a long time ago. We can then use these phrases in 2 ways. We can say that something happened that time ago. So for example, I saw him 2 months ago. Lo vi hace 2 meses. 5 years ago, I went to Mexico. Hace 5 años fui a México. Then the other option is that we can say that it has been a while since I've done something or I've been doing something for a while. So if you're catching up with a good friend that you haven't seen in a while, you could say something like, I haven't seen you in a long time. Hace mucho tiempo que no te veo. Now note that te veo is in the present tense. So we need to say literally, it makes a long time that I don't see you. Now, similarly, you'll notice at the start of the last few videos, I've been talking about how long I've been learning Spanish for. Now, I might say something like this. I've been learning Spanish for more than 20 years. Hace más de 20 años que aprendo español. Literally, it makes more than 20 years that I learn Spanish. So I would suggest that you try this sentence out for yourself. How long have you been learning Spanish? Try to combine hace with the period of time that you've been learning, and then follow it with aprendo español, I'm learning Spanish, or estudio español, I'm studying Spanish. And remember that these need to be in the present tense. That's the key with these kinds of phrases. Now, for the next use of hacer, I'm giving away one of my big secrets. I mean, not really, but this is a good example of something I like to test students with. So if you're ever in a test with me in the future and you've seen this video, you'll now know how to answer this question. So I'll often ask a student, how do you say can I ask you a question in Spanish? Now, it is very tempting to use, say, the verbs pedir or preguntar, and students will often say something like, te pregunto una pregunta. But this is really awkward. It's a weird combination in Spanish, pregunto and pregunta. Instead, in Spanish, questions aren't something that we ask, they are something that we make. So to say, can I ask you a question? The best translation would be te hago una pregunta, or also te puedo hacer una pregunta. Now, these two are generally interchangeable. Another example, they want to ask me a few questions. Quieren hacerme unas preguntas. Now, note that we have a compound phrase here, so we can also say me quieren hacer unas preguntas. Next, let's look at hacer as a verb like gustar. So we'll see it in the form of me hace. Now, the main situation that this will occur is in the colloquial expression hacer falta, which means to need. Literally, it would be like saying to make missing. For example, I need more time to finish the project. Me hace falta más tiempo para terminar el proyecto. I need 2 eggs to make the cake. Me hacen falta 2 huevos para hacer la tarta. Now, notice that when we say to here, that we need to match hacen in plural. Now, something else you may have noticed in the last 2 examples is that I used I need as the translation of me hace falta into English. And so students will often ask me, what is the difference between necesito and me hace falta? Now, in practice, the meaning of these two are very close. The critical thing for you to recognize as a student is just that me hace falta can be a substitute for necesito, and you'll hear natives using it a lot. Now, to understand when to say necesito and when to say me hace falta, consider a parallel in English. Imagine you were collecting baseball cards, and you might say something like, I need 1 more card to complete the collection, or I'm missing 1 card to complete the collection. Now, for the most part, these 2 sentences express almost exactly the same idea, but maybe there is a subtle difference where the second one might be, I'm missing a card, implying that maybe it's harder to get. Now, we can translate these 2 into Spanish as necesito una tarjeta para completar la colección, or me hace falta una tarjeta para completar la colección. And for completeness, because I think some students will ask, we could also say me falta una tarjeta para completar la colección. And in this case, we're using the verb faltar. Now, just like English, the difference here is very subtle, with the first Spanish option focusing more on the need, and the last is focusing more on the lack. Now, if you want to learn more about the Spanish verb faltar, where I talk about the choice between me hace falta and me falta, I've written an article on this verb. I'll leave a link to the article below. Now, for the next use, I kind of have to admit something, and that is when I do these videos, there may be things that I miss, que me falta. And last week I did a video on poner and how to use it as a verb like gustar with emotions. And one of the commenters said below the video, me pone feliz. And the second I saw that comment, I realized, oh no, I forgot to talk about this option with the verb poner. So most adjectives of emotion can go with poner, except feliz, which is really the main exception. So we could say, for example, it makes me happy to see you. Me hace feliz verte. Now, technically, my understanding is that it is grammatically possible to say me pone feliz, so it's not a fatal error. But if you ask a Spanish native, they might say that it sounds very strange. So instead, it's best to say me pone contento or me hace feliz as a translation of it makes me happy. And again, following up on last week's video, you can just think to yourself that feliz goes with hacer, but then all other adjectives of emotion, contento, pone, triste, they're going to go with poner. And then for nouns of emotion, I'm going to talk about that in an upcoming video. Okay, next, let's consider hacer as a reflexive verb, me hago. So the reflexive form hacerse usually means to become, and it applies to becoming something that is not easy, like a new profession, a change in nationality, or maybe religion. So for example, I'm becoming a lawyer. Me hago abogado. Now you can think of this literally as I'm making myself lawyer. She became a nun in 2005. Se hizo monja en 2005. Literally, she made herself a nun. Another example, we want to get famous. Queremos hacernos famosos. Now note that we have a compound phrase here, so we can also say nos queremos hacer famosos. Now again, I want to highlight that with all of these changes, they are kind of hard to do, and take work. That's what hacerse is all about. To make yourself, a lawyer or a nun or a famous, you're going to need time and effort. Now, in the past, whenever I introduce a verb that can be translated as to become in English, a student will often ask me about the 7 possible ways to translate to become into Spanish. And this is actually a lesson that I personally really struggled with over the years. That's because when you get presented with a lesson that lists 7 possible translations of one English verb, it can be really hard to memorize and internalize that lesson. For me, it is better to pick one option like today's hacerse and then practice that for a while to really get used to it. Otherwise, when you try to translate I'm becoming a lawyer, your brain may go to that lesson and you'll start to work your way down the 7 options and try to remember which one is which and which one applies in this situation. It's better to just practice me hago profesor, me hago abogado, me hago médico. And then later you can pick another option and work on that. At least that's what worked much better for me. Now, if you've been following the last few videos in this series, you'll actually have seen that I covered 2 of the other forms of to become in Spanish. So if you actually watch this series the whole way through, you'll actually get the whole lesson on the 7 different translations on becoming, but I've broken it down in a way that I believe is more digestible and easier to learn. But as always, I want to hear your opinion. Please share your thoughts below. Now, the last thing we're going to discuss is another colloquial phrase with hacer, and that is hacer caso, to pay attention. And this is for paying attention to advice or warnings or instructions. So imagine you are watching the instructions for something important, maybe like the safety briefing on a plane, and the person sitting next to you has a low care factor. They might say something like, I don't pay attention to these things. No hago caso de esas cosas. Another example, my wife told me it was going to rain. I didn't pay attention and now I'm completely soaked. Mi mujer me dijo que iba a llover. No le hice caso y ahora estoy completamente empapado. So again, here we have no le hice caso, which would be literally, I didn't make case to her. It sounds really weird when we translate it literally, but better translations would be I didn't listen to her or I didn't pay attention to her. All right, so that wraps up this lesson. Le hiciste caso a todos los usos de hacer. If you'd like to watch the other videos in this series, I'll put the playlist here.